This is the PHP video 5, and today we'll be learning about switch statements, while loops, for loops, functions, arrays, and include files. So let's start off with the switch statement. So a switch statement is used to perform different actions based on different conditions. So we use the switch statement to select one of many blocks of code to be executed. So this right here that I typed up, this is the syntax for the PHP switch statement. Let's take a look about what's going on in here. First, we have a single expression. N, which is most often a variable, is evaluated once. So N, this one, it is evaluated once. The value of the expression is then compared with the values of each case in the structure. So the value of this is compared to each of the cases in the structure. So this is compared to this. And if there is a match, the block of code associated with that case is executed. So let's say that there's a match in this case label 1, right? So what happens is that this code is going to be executed. We put a break after this block of code because we want to prevent the computer from going to the next block of code automatically. If none of these labels are matched, then what happens is the computer goes to the default code, which is used when there's no match that's found. So this is the switch statement syntax. Now let's move on to while loops. Alright, so while loops execute a block of code while the specified condition is true. So there are many types of PHP loops. So often when you write code, you want the same block of code to run over and over again in a row. So instead of adding several almost equal lines of code in a script, we can use loops to perform a task more efficiently. So we have a while loop, which loops through a block of code as long as the specified condition is true. A do while loop loops through a block of code once and then repeats the loop as long as the specified condition is true. A for loop loops through a block of code a specified number of times, and a for each loop loops through a block of code for each element in an array. So let's go over the PHP while loop. The PHP while loop executes a block of code as long as a specified condition is true. Now let's take a look at the syntax for a PHP while loop. So while the condition is true, the code is to be executed. So what's happening here is that when the computer reads the while, and when the computer reads while, it reads the condition is true. So when the condition is true, this code on this line is to be executed. And if this condition is not true, when the computer reads it and it's not true, then the computer will skip over this line of code and move on to the next block of code. Now that we covered the PHP while loop, let's cover the PHP do while loop. The do while loop will always execute a block of code once. It will then check the condition and repeat the loop while the specified condition is true. Now, let's type up the PHP do while loop. So that's the do. This is the code to be executed. Make sure to put your semicolons at the end. That's extremely important, so don't forget that. So while a condition is true. Oh, whoops. Alright, so what's happening here? When the computer reads do, it's running that the code is asking the computer to do this block of code only when this condition is true. So what happens is that the computer will execute the block of code, this block of code once, and after it executes it once, it'll check the condition and see if it's still true, and if it is still true, then the computer will go back and execute this block of code again. When the condition is not true, the computer will stop executing this code and go to the next block of code to run. Alright, now that we completed the while loop and the do while loop, let's move on to PHP for loops. So PHP loops execute a block of code a specific number of times. But a PHP for loop is used when you know in advance how many times a script should run. So let's look at the syntax for the PHP for loop. For init counter, there's many parameters for the PHP for loop, but I'll be explaining them after I type them up. So init counter, test counter, and increment counter. So those are the three parameters for the PHP for loop. Then we do open parentheses, and then the code to be executed is typed in here. And then you close the parentheses. So there are three parameters in the for loop. There's the init counter, there's the test counter, and there's also the increment counter. So the init counter initializes the loop counter value. The test counter is evaluated for each loop iteration. And if it evaluates to be true, the loop continues. And when it evaluates to be false, the loop ends. The increment counter increases the loop counter value. So this is always a number. Or it could be a variable plus a number. But it's always the value of a number. Now that we reviewed PHP for loops, let's move on to PHP for each loops. The PHP for each loop only works on arrays, and it's only used to loop through each key or value pair in an array. This is the PHP for each loop syntax. So for each, open parentheses, array as a value, and then close parentheses and open bracket, and this is the code to be executed. And then you close the bracket. Great, so this is the PHP for each loop syntax. So for each loop iteration, the value of the current array element is assigned to this value, and the array pointer is moved by 1 until it reaches the last array element. Okay, so we have now covered PHP switch statements, PHP while loops, PHP do while loops, PHP for loops, and PHP for each loops. Now let's move on to PHP 5 functions. There are many functions in PHP. The real power of PHP comes from functions, and it has more than 1,000 built-in functions. but right now we're only going to go over one of them. A PHP user-defined function. Besides the built-in PHP functions, we can create our own functions. A function is a block of statements that can be used repeatedly in a program. A function will not execute immediately when a page loads, and a function will be executed by a call to the function. So now we're going to go over the syntax for a user-defined function in PHP. So the user-defined function declaration always starts with the word function. So function, and then this is the function name. Function name. And then parentheses, open bracket, and then the code to be executed. And then you close the brackets. So, a function name can start with a letter or underscore. So the function name can start with a letter or an underscore, but it cannot start with a number. A tip for a function name is that you should give it a name that reflects what the function actually does. But function names are not case sensitive, but it doesn't really matter. But it's always easier to read when you have the second word, the first letter of the second word capitalized. Now that we went over the PHP user-defined function, I'm going to just list some other PHP functions. There are PHP function arguments that allow information to be passed to functions through arguments. And there's also a PHP default argument value, which shows how to use a default parameter. There are many more functions in PHP, but going over all of those would take a lot of time. Now let's move on to PHP 5 arrays. An array stores multiple values in one single variable. What is an array? An array is a special variable which can hold more than one value at a time. If you have a list of items, like a list of car names for example, storing cars in the single variables would look similar to this. Cars equals, let's say, Volvo. Nobody really has Volvo these days, but that's okay. And then let's have our second car to be like a BMW. And then our third car to be a Toyota. Oh, whoops, I forgot to change the number. So we have a car 1, car 2, and car 3, and our third car is a Toyota. So this is how it would look like if we listed everything in a single variable. But however, what if we want to loop through the cars and find a specific one? And what if you had like not 3 cars but 300, like you owned a car dealership? Would you actually write all of the variables for the cars like 300 times? No, right? So we have to create an array. An array can hold many values under a single name, and you have to access the values by referring to an index number. In PHP, the array function is used to create an array. So this is the array function. In PHP, that's the array function. In PHP, there are 3 types of arrays: indexed arrays, associative arrays, and multidimensional arrays. An index array is an array with a numeric index. An associative array are arrays with named keys, and multidimensional arrays are arrays containing one or more arrays. There are many other more Okay, let's move on to include files. The include or require statements takes all the text or code or markup that exists in the specified file and occupies it in the file that uses the include statement. Including files is very useful when you want to include the same PHP, HTML, or text on multiple pages of a website. PHP include and require statements. It is possible to insert the content of one PHP file into another PHP file before the server executes it with the include or require statement. The include or require statements are identical except upon failure. So if you want to execute to go on and show users the output even if the include file is missing, use the include statement. Otherwise, in case of framework, CMS, or complex PHP application coding, always use the require statement to include a key file to the flow of execution. This will help avoid compromising your application security and integrity just in case one key file is accidentally missing. Including files saves a lot of work. So, this is the syntax for the include file. So include, and then you type in the file name, or you could do require, and then the file name. So both of the include and require statements are similar, except when they have error messages. All right. Now that we went over PHP, the PHP arrays, PHP while loops, PHP for loops, PHP functions, and PHP switch statements, our video is over. Thank you.